not so great as a manager in post goals. The Neville brothers haven't done so great as a manager. We can also, of course, discuss Steven Gerrard in Saudi Arabia. Al-Ettifaq is not doing that well. So is this now a conversation where something is clearly wrong with young-ish former player managers who from England who are not necessarily doing that well, successful when you compare them to other European nations? James Ollie, I want to begin with you. Obviously, you cover England a lot, specifically, within, not just on the pitch, not just under Gareth Southgate, but also having seen what these young managers have been able and not been able to do. What do you make of this? Why do you think it's so difficult to transfer amazing playing careers to managerial ones, specifically in England?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think firstly, there isn't a direct correlation between the ability you have as a player and your ability as a manager. I think a lot of these, I mean, I'm not saying that the managers we're talking about here didn't work very hard as players because they had to get to that top level. But I think a lot of their skill, a lot of what made them stand out was almost instinctive. It was intuitive, and it's quite difficult if you don't have the communication skills to be able to convey that to a group of players who maybe are less talented or operating at a lower level. If you take a few examples, if you look at Wayne Rooney's managerial career, for example, he's not managed at a Premier League team at the high level. He's dealing with players who have never got anywhere close, really, or most of them have never got anywhere close to the level that he's played at. And so I would imagine it's quite difficult for him to try and, there's a sort of level of assumed knowledge among the top players that those players in the level below don't necessarily have. But I think just to come back to sort of the wider point about the golden generation, that was a moniker that was given to that England squad in 2001 when they went and beat England, when they went and beat Germany 5-1 in Munich in a World Cup qualifier. And it was a massive thing, that game, because there's been a long-standing rivalry between England and Germany, and Germany certainly had the upper hand in that rivalry for a long, long time. You think about the Euro '96 semi-final, most obviously at Wembley. And then I think when England won so emphatically in Munich that night, it really heralded what we hoped as England fans anyway would be the dawning of a new era. And Adam Crozier, who was the chief executive of the FA at the time, described them as the golden generation when they'd won a game 5-1 in Germany in 2001. And this was at the start, really, of their international careers. And I think in retrospect, what should have happened there is, I think you earn the right to be called a golden generation. You're golden because you win things, right? You are decorated. You have trophies, you have medals to show for it. And what happened really with that England group is that they were pitched at a level of expectation that they never were able to reach. And what we've seen in the ensuing years since most of them retired is that they're still trying to live up to that moniker as managers.
Janusz, as a former player, and obviously I want your input as well on this, golden generation, as James was talking of those England players, etc. And Wayne Rooney, of course, one of the recent ones, the disaster that was the Birmingham City short tenure. But as a former player, Janusz, is it difficult, or is it something maybe even personal to you? Did you ever want to be a manager, and did you think, is there an extra hurdle as a player trying to think that maybe I can't do what I want to do to other players on the pitch that I once did myself?
Absolutely. I think there's a certain level of frustration in maybe teaching the concepts to the players that came to you as second nature, right? I mean, we've heard this from Thierry Henry and many, many others, that lack of patience, because that's what it takes. Training players at the highest level, at any level, takes patience. And sometimes what came easy to you as a player becomes that much more difficult, especially when in the back of your mind, you know that maybe some of these players aren't capable of doing what you're asking them to do, because you're asking them to do or get around concepts, as I've said, that to you were so easy. And yet it takes repetition over and over and over. That's sort of a patient that when you're teaching, say, patterns of play, patterns of attacking or defending, that becomes frustrating and difficult. Not to mention that, a lot of these players, not all, because we're going to talk about those managers later, but those players that are fast track because of who they were, and maybe lack that experience and maybe that time on the bench under a great manager or two or three or four before you actually feel comfortable kind of going out there and forgetting the fact that you are a great player, and realizing that you're managing players that maybe aren't capable of what you want as quickly as you used to get those concepts.
So, James, here's one. Obviously, this isn't just an English problem. I mean, look at Andrea Pirlo, of course. Thierry Henry exactly hasn't gone through a predominantly successful managerial head coaching career as of yet. But there are great examples of former stars. You mentioned, obviously, when you talk about golden generation, you have to win something. You have to be a champion. And there's no better example than the likes of Zinedine Zidane or Xavi, or even Xavi Alonso, who's doing so great with Leverkusen. What do you make of those storylines? Is there a difference in the way those successful stories as a manager has come about as opposed to the ones that we mentioned at the top of the show?
Well, there's a couple of things there. I mean, if you think about, you mentioned Xavi. I mean, he obviously came through Xavi, Pep Guardiola. I mean, Mikel Arteta was there from La Masia, came through the Barcelona ranks at similar sorts of times. And those three are now obviously managing Guardiola, obviously arguably the greatest manager of his generation, and a heavily influential figure for so many others. You think about 2002, that Argentina team that actually lost to England in the World Cup group stage. Diego Simeone and Mauricio Pochettino were both in that team. They've obviously both gone on to be high-level managers themselves. There just hasn't been, even though these players came through together with England, there hasn't been the sort of one almost helping the other and managerial kind of, kicking on. And I think what's quite interesting is that I watched a debate a few years ago with Rio Ferdinand, Frank Lampard and Steven Gerrard, and they were talking about the reasons why they felt that so-called golden generation failed on the pitch as players. And while they took responsibility for their own culpability, that they didn't always bring their own individual high level, and that they admitted that there were cliques in the dressing room at the time because of how intense the Premier League battles were, Manchester United and Arsenal going at it around the turn of the millennium, then Chelsea coming into the fray in the sort of middle to late 2000s. They all highlighted managerial shortcomings. They all talked about an adherence to a rigid 4-4-2. Most of this period was played under Sven-Göran Eriksson, and it was about it was a culture as though let's pick our best 11 players and they will go out on the pitch and sort it out in a rough 4-4-2 system. And broadly speaking, when their talent was so far superior to another nation at a World Cup, so typically in the group stages, England would do okay. They'd get through the group stage, their individual talent would get them through. But as soon as they came up against a team that was coached, that was well drilled, that had a little bit of tactical innovation about them, and it didn't even have to be that much, England was suddenly played off the park. And I do wonder whether these players that talk about that now, whether there's some sort of legacy effect of experiencing that as players and therefore not being able to instill that as managers. I mean, obviously those three in particular were hugely successful at club level. They played under great managers. But, even, for example, in that chat, Lampard talked about how free he was at Chelsea, that he had the players around him provided the structure and he had that freedom to go and influence the game from midfield. A little bit like Steven Gerrard had that license to go and play. Wayne Rooney, of course, sometimes he was played out on the left to accommodate Cristiano Ronaldo, but quite often you think of him as a number 10. He had a couple of seasons as a number 9. He was, again, at his best when he's given that license to go and play. So the idea of thinking about the game in a specific, detailed, tactical way, you think of someone like Mikel Arteta, for example, who I interviewed many, many times as a player. You could kind of tell from a long way out that he was going to go into coaching. You'd have no idea that he'd be potentially a successful manager as he looks like he's going to be in the work that he's done at Arsenal. But you kind of knew straight away that he had the brain for it. He lived and breathed football. He thought about the game in a really intelligent and challenging assumptions kind of way. And I'm not sure that those players, those top English players, ever did that. They never had to go abroad. By and large, they all played in the Premier League. They all had structures around them where, yes, some of them, and I'm not knocking these guys at club level, they were phenomenal players, hugely successful. But if we're talking about why they've not been able to translate that on the international stage, when it does get a bit more tactical, it does get a bit more technical, and then as managers, when they've got to impart that wisdom on a group of players who don't have their ability, maybe that's where the shortfall comes from.
Yeah. I think also. Yeah. Go ahead, Janusz.
No, you're right, but you're talking about structure, and I mean, it's a whole package, isn't it? Right? I mean, the playing style is one thing, but the ability to deal with experienced players, the ability to deal with management, the ability to understand scouting and how it works, and the sort of players that you want. I think there's more to that because there's so many high expectations, high profile teams that they get to. Maybe it's a little bit too early. I mean, now that we think about it, and of course that's hindsight. But you look at Gary Neville. I mean, you look at Valencia, massive club. It's then Peter Lim, as everybody knows, not an easy manager to deal with. Look, since he's left, look where Valencia are and how many managers they've had. So yeah, there's some friendships, and that's maybe how he got that job. But then comes the reality of dealing with, say, Peter Lim, or for Xavi to go to Barcelona and deal with the financial issues that they have. Maybe thinking, yes, Xavi understood the club, and he knows the pressure of the club. But that's not necessarily true if you look at the finances of Barcelona, what can or can't be done. From the outside looking in, you think, well, I'll just come back to what I know. I know, every corner of that club. But I just think that, part of the issue is not just the managers picking those jobs, but the clubs thinking. I often think, what were they thinking in giving some of these young managers with very little experience those sort of high-profile jobs? So I just think that for a manager, I remember, obviously I wasn't coaching at the highest level, but I was coaching at the youth level. I just assumed that some of the training sessions, some of the drills that I've done with many managers that I've learned, but then sort of the impatience of running through them, thinking that if you do it once or twice, it's just gonna happen like that. So I think it's a full package, and timing is also very, very important. When do you go to a club like Barcelona? When you go to a club like Aston Villa, like Steven Gerrard, right? Timing is very often key, and I'm sure we'll maybe talk about some of the successes like Zinedine Zidane. I'm still not 100% sure how great he was, right? Because it's he's been surrounded by great players, and that's the only club that he's managed. It'd be nice to see if he can replicate that elsewhere, because we don't know.
We don't know, but there was a step process for Zidane. He was at Castilla before he went to Real Madrid. The same with Xavi Alonso before Bayer Leverkusen. He learned at Real Sociedad.
Well, that's what we've talked about, the experience in different clubs, also as a player. Xavi Alonso, I mean, you're talking, Liverpool, you're talking Bayern Munich, you're talking
but as a manager, right, he learned the trade as well. Real Sociedad B, and then he moved up. The same with Mikel Arteta, learning under Pep Guardiola, etc. But you do mention a very good point, Janis, about timing. Timing is a big thing. And the other point that you mentioned, Janis, that's important as well, is about you expecting, or a former player expecting, that your players are going to replicate and do what you want them to do. Our very own Nader Manoa talked with Vincent Kompany about this very thing for Burnley, that he must be wanting to just put himself in that 11, James Ollie. It must be very difficult for Vincent Kompany to sit on the sidelines after knowing you can do a better job. Thierry Henry, when he was managing Montreal Impact, there's literally a video from MLS that's showing him so frustrated on the sidelines because these players are not being able to do. Of course, they can't do what Thierry Henry can do. So what do you make of that? Do you think like these former players, especially the ones that Janis was talking about, Zinedine Zidane, one of the greatest players the game has ever seen, do you think that they stand on that sideline and just think, my God, why can't they do what I did for like 15, 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, because some of it, for those talents, those generational talents, some of it, there is a percentage of it that is instinctive, that you can't look. If you could teach it, then we'd have 20 Zidanes in every team, but you can't. I wouldn't mind watching it. I don't think they defend very well, but I wouldn't mind watching it. But these talents stand out because there is an ability within them that, yes, needs to be extracted and coached and developed and nurtured, but it's there in their core, it's there in their soul. And I mean, I can understand why, if you've got that within you and you're looking at a group of players, who can't reach those same levels, why that can be frustrating. But I think someone like that can manage. There's two ways you can manage, really. You can manage with your aura, if you like, and the force of your personality, or you can manage by your communication skills. And I think, to bring this back slightly to the England element that, Frank Lampard, Steven Gerrard, those kind of players, they undoubtedly had an aura about them as players. And I'm sure when they started in their managerial careers, and they still will with younger players who've watched them, come through, literally grown up watching them score goals and win games every week in the Premier League and play 100 odd times for England. But to take an example, I thought was quite interesting that when Lampard lost his job at Chelsea, and I heard similar at Everton when he lost his job there, that a lot of the players in that squad both squads talked about a lack of communication they felt from Frank Lampard, particularly those players who weren't in the team. They felt that they didn't get enough of a dialogue from the manager. They felt that they didn't understand enough about why they weren't playing, what they needed to do to improve, exactly what their role would be when they did play. And I sort of thought, well, Frank Lampard, for example, was a player who's managed quite well into his mid-late 30s. He played on quite a long time. He didn't go out at 30, 31, having played, 40, 50 games a season. He was going, went to New York. He went obviously to Man City later in his career. He was managed. He had to have his game time slightly decreased over time as his body, caught up with him, time caught up with him. And you'd think someone who's lived that experience would know what it's like to be on the periphery of a team, would know perhaps not just the career at the very highest level, being the game changer, the match winner all the time, but to also know the bit part role, to know exactly what it feels like to be frustrated that you can't contribute and wanting to do that more. So that's what I go back to Zidane. I think he obviously can communicate very well, but he still has that aura about him, and I think that matters a lot more when you're dealing with top level players. Real Madrid is about managing egos about as much as it is about anything. Carlo Ancelotti having great success there. He's not, from people I speak to, he's not a coach. He's not a coaching expert, but he's a great communicator. He inspires confidence in people, and he has that aura about him, and that combination can be equally as effective as a coach who is someone like Emery, for example, who is. I mean, you think about the upgrade from Steven Gerrard to Unai Emery in the last. And LME, I know you'll be following this most closely out of all of us. You look at the transformation that Villa have had with largely the same group of players. Nobody took more points in the calendar year last year than Villa, aside from Man City. It's an incredible transformation,
again,
and that team is so well drilled now. They are so well organised, and they are night and day from again, you'll know better than me, but the sort of turgid football that Gerrard spent 80 million and then couldn't impose a style, went back to his old players to try and get him out of trouble, and it was just a mess at the end. And you contrast that with the work that Emery's done. And sometimes we talk about timing. Sometimes you need a coach with aura. Sometimes you need a coach who can communicate. And sometimes you need a coach who can drill a team and instill a structure. Obviously, the perfect combination is both. But there are very few managers who can deliver that on their own.
And you need that personality, right? I mean, the very first moment you have to sell the players, because players are going to be skeptical, especially about the big names. Immediately, when a manager like Gerrard, Lampard, right after they finish their career, get a high-profile job, the first thing I would do, and maybe I'm too cynical, but I think most people would be, you'd be interested, right? I think we've talked about the likes of Klopp and Sir Alex Ferguson. I think their ability to maybe delegate and communicate and personality is very important, because players and managers don't like to. I know many that don't delegate that. You have to be able to stand up and say, I have somebody. My coaching staff and coaching staff in general is super important. Who do you get? Is it somebody that maybe knows more than you? And that's important. Some former players can't do that. They just get their friends. They may be good coaches, but there may not be the type of people that will kind of challenge you as well as a manager. And I think that's very important. So that personality also, I'm thinking of Steven Gerrard and Frank Lampard, they don't come across to me as maybe great motivators. Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't been coached, but just looking at them on the sideline. I mean, Unai Emery, and we've talked about it, Luis, before, right? I mean, he got very old to Arsenal because he's tedious, isn't he? I mean, he's out there. He's managing you. You're standing more than you're training. And he was gone in his first job. Yet, he found a group of players at Aston Villa after Gerrard that maybe needed that, because he didn't provide that. And they've bought into it. They saw success immediately. And your job is much, much easier. But Unai Emery could have been, the Unai Emery from Arsenal.